Hey everybody, Peter Maravellis here. I'm hoping this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic in the land of the virtual. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums, moving into the winter of 2022 and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. As many of you know, City Lights has, since its inception, served as a kind of physical gateway for the intersection of literature with the arts, music, philosophy, politics, and so on. The beat culture had cross-pollinated with mid-century artists of San Francisco in very deep ways. Bruce Conner, Jess, and of course, Jay DeFeo, who is the subject of this evening's talk, all played an essential role in the emergence of the avant-garde in the Bay Area. So City Lights was always a kind of a way station and sort of a clubhouse where many of these figures would meet. And North Beach served as a kind of New Jerusalem for those who had an interest in literature and music and the arts. So tonight, we explore a hitherto forgotten and yet very significant episode in San Francisco art history, and specifically in the career of the mid-century Bay Area artist Jay DeFeo. In his book, Rip Tales, Jay DeFeo's Estocada and Other Pieces, Jordan Stein, like a great detective that he is, has unearthed the compelling story surrounding DeFeo's artwork entitled Estocada. In the process, he beautifully merges its material history, interweaving it with stories about other Bay Area artists and offering us insights into their work and the trajectory of art history in the Bay Area. This is a story that has great resonance with us here at City Lights, and we think you'll enjoy it too. Jordan Stein is a curator and writer based in San Francisco. With Will Brown, he is the author of Bruce Conner, Brass Handles, and with Jason Fulford, he co-edited Where to Score, both titles published by J&L Books. He's organized exhibitions at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, Artist Space, the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago, Matthew Marks Gallery, amongst others. In addition to working independently with institutions, he operates Cushion Works, an exhibition and program space in the Mission District. He is, of course, a graduate of the San Francisco Art Institute. And joining him tonight in conversation is Bruce Hainley. Bruce Hainley is the author of the books Under the Sign of I'm going to get this wrong, Sturdivant's Volte-Face, and Art and Culture, both books published by Semiotext Books, as well as a collaboration he wrote with John Waters titled Art, a Sex Book. He is also the editor of Kami Pinko Guy. He co-chairs the graduate art program at Art Center College of Design and is a contributing editor at Art Forum. Now, it is a great pleasure to welcome Jordan Stein and Bruce Hainley. Give them a warm welcome. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights Live.
Hey, good evening. Good evening. Thanks so much, Peter. I want to thank Peter and City Lights for inviting Jordan and me to have a chance to talk about Jordan's really great book, Rip Tales. I wanted to thank Soberscove Press for publishing it. And Jordan, I want to thank you for asking me to be an interlocutor tonight. So, hey.
Hey, thank you.
So I thought, it would be, the book is so marvelously written and full of so many engaging ideas. And I thought it might be great just to get us started, if you don't mind reading a little bit of it and reading from very close to the beginning of the book, which is a chapter on the artist Trisha Donnelly, who you first met as a teacher at San Francisco Art Institute. And you're going to be reading a passage that's about a photographic work, if that's how to delimit it, of Trisha's called My Blind Friends. And I'm going to let you read a little bit about that and we'll take things from there.
Sure. Well, let me say, Bruce, it's thanks for being here and doing this. I'm such an admirer of your work, and of course that you had anything positive to say about what I did is a dream come true. And to be involved in this event with City Lights is just wonderful. It's been such an important place for me in my life in San Francisco, and to think of all the hours that I've logged there. And the Jay must have logged there. It's surreal. It feels like a kind of really special event. So thanks. I'm happy to read a little bit from that beginning section about Trisha. As you mentioned, I've just been at a lecture that she gave in 2003 as soon as I moved to San Francisco, and she talked about this particular work, Blind Friends. And then I was lucky enough to sign up for her class, a critique seminar as a grad student. Anyway, here we go. Trisha broadcasted from the outer reaches of an altogether different dial, one that didn't quite bridge my irreconcilable gap, but rendered it irrelevant. Through long, generous, unpredictable conversations and observations, art emerged as a private and idiosyncratic language, born not from a careful school of thought, but instead from a tangle of inklings and affections, commitments and contradictions, expectations and embarrassments, reflections and suspicions, a stew of propositions inspired by lived and imagined experience. Why shouldn't art be as simultaneously giving and withholding as the world? I think Trisha's aim in the classroom was to coax honest expressions of how we thought and felt and how we were learning to think and feel, rather than fully baked artworks. How were we trying and failing to make meaning for ourselves? Without saying it, she made it clear that the business of making outward sense was an altogether different game, and we would be wise to develop an immunity to the explanatory, such as wall texts or press releases, not to mention objects of consensus like reputations or desirability. In this, we weren't introduced to the art world, but the world, something we'd all forsaken in the unenviable quest to be taken up and in by art's apparatus. These are my blind friends, those who see by other means. These are my allegiances, my many senses out there in the weather, working with and against the wind. This is me studying the invisible by its ripples. Although art history is dominated by the visual, sight doesn't equal presence, and neither does its opposite equal absence. This perspective totally mangled my hunger for approval, let alone legibility. It wasn't easy, maybe it never is. Once, after we discussed a series of short videos I'd presented in class, Trisha emailed to report that my head had appeared blurry to her for the entire length of our conversation. An artist named Sarah was in one of those semester-long critique classes. When she wasn't in the studio, she painted trompe-l'oeil ceilings in Tony Pacific Heights homes for hire, lying on a scaffold all day, brush in hand, pointed straight upward. One afternoon in class, Sarah leaned 2 giant sheets of plywood against the wall. She'd drawn the simplest outline of a large dresser in pencil across the panels, and on a single shelf painted a small blue vase. Sarah didn't say much about what she'd made, but it was clear that she'd been earnestly driven to make it and was nervous about not having much to reveal or assert beyond the thing itself. It was too strange to be fake, too involved to be lazy, and too beautiful to be cynical. It was exciting that a painter specializing in painstaking illusionism would take the trouble to not take the trouble, that she'd been driven to make this thing at all. As I recall in the critique, we talked about Sarah's grandmother. After graduation, I traded several mornings of my life serving orange juice and bagels to tourists in exchange for free rent in an old army fort operated by Hosteling International in the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge. I shared the 3-bedroom house with fellow employees of Cafe Franco, named for the older Italian man who was its founding manager. The empty house next door was often used for group events like meetings and parties. At some point, I got permission to stage a one-night exhibition there, mostly comprised of artworks made by my SFAI chums, including Sarah's plywood piece. Many years later, I ran into Sarah in the Mission where I lived. She'd married Adam, a fellow classmate, and was expecting a baby. When I asked about the leaning dresser, she confessed that they didn't have much room for it in their apartment, and that she transformed the artwork into an actual dresser. She'd cut it up into shelving. She told me she still had slides of the original piece and asked if I'd like to have them, delivered them the next week. They've sat on my desk for years. I've never quite known what to do with them or for them.
It's so great. It's such a generous way of thinking about that work, but also about the reciprocity of teaching and what it leads to. And I thought it's funny, in my head, I remembered them as you had photographs of on your desk, not slides. But I'm going to ask you a question about photography anyway. It struck me in reading the book again in preparation for our talk and following you had an excellent discussion with Hilton Als a few weeks ago, that photography is very much a time-based medium. And you discussed that, and the book is so much about what that might mean, a time-based medium. It brings so many of the aspects of the book together. Certainly the remains of DeFeo's Estocada, which is the book's main through line, but photography is also your entrance via William Eggleston's photography to art in some sense, or seeing yourself as an artist and going to art school in San Francisco. But photography also grounds so many of the other artists you discuss. Trisha Donnelly's belief in photography and use of it, Vincent Fecteau's deployment of the magazine page and the picture frame in recent projects, the great Dawn Alison's private Polaroid studio, Lutz Bacher, there's so many. And I just wondered if you'd talk about the photographic and what it means to you.
Yeah, well, that's such a big, great question. Like, earmark the next 20 minutes to just do it. Photography was really my introduction to the world of art, or the world of fine art, sort of in my own life, on my own terms, not as a kid going to museums in Washington, D.C. with my parents. A really electrifying moment in St. Mark's bookstore, looking at 2 1/4, a William Eggleston book, and I'd never seen anything like it. And it's like it had just descended from an alien spacecraft or something. And then I moved to San Francisco and studied photography. And then I met people like Trisha and people working in all sorts of different media, and started to make work in video and in performance and even in sculpture and things like this. But it is worth noting that the conversation really turns back to photography a lot in these books and with these artists, and that none of these artists are really photographers, or none are sort of straight photographers, you might say. And so I guess, we decided that I would read this Trisha section sort of like right before we went live. So the Trisha's on my mind, and I'm thinking about one piece in particular. Maybe it's a way of sort of going in before we go out, but maybe it's from 2000. I think I saw it when I was in school, so maybe 2005 or 2004, and it's called The Redwood and the Raven, I think. And it's a series of black and white photographs, like fairly modestly sized, as I sort of recall, like face size. And I saw them in a gallery or in a museum. I can't really remember now, but the big point is that there's a woman, they're black and white pictures, and there's a woman sort of frozen, and she's dancing in front of a tree. And maybe somebody told me, or maybe I read it on a wall text, or maybe I just learned afterwards from a friend who knows that that piece is animated, but in sort of hyper slow motion. Obviously, you know what I'm talking about. So let's say there are 30 something photographs, and once a day, the museum or the gallery staff is instructed to change the photograph out. And they're sequential. So you can think about them as like frames in a movie still, in a video production or something. And that, at that time, when I was really invested in folks like William Eggleston, who I still really do care about, to be face to face with a work like this, and the ideas that it inspired really changed the way that I thought about what a photograph could be, or what a photograph could do. I didn't know that a photograph could be made by someone who wasn't a photographer. And I also didn't know that a photograph, let's just say, if the whole film wasn't there for a viewer to see, then a viewer got to see the film in their own head. And that seemed to me like such a sly, such a beautiful, just like a really generous kind of conceptual moment. None of the fragility of the conceptual stuff that I knew of at the time. And so if it implicated the viewer as an actor or as a kind of filmmaker, then that kind of like shocked me into the present moment. And I guess that's how that's how I think about a lot of work now. Like, does it pull me away from something that I'm thinking about, from my life, from my daily experience, and provide like just a new way to be or a new way to think? And then it's funny too, I came across this great quote from, you know this woman, Lynn Higinian, who's taught at Cal? Yeah, forever, of course, she, amazing poet and critic and language poet. And it was, I hadn't thought that it related so much to these ideas in photography and with Trisha, but she said something like, I'm face to face with a still life, but it isn't even still. And she said, even it isn't still. I was like, so beautiful. It's like, it just blows apart the idea of a still life and the idea that like anything is still, that we are still, being is something that is unstill. And I guess maybe to try to come back to photography, you know, maybe photography is just a great way for artists to like test that idea, or to kind of flirt with ideas of ontology in that way. Like, are we all really in motion? Because photography really does still the world, you know, maybe more than any other medium. So it lets you test ideas really quickly, whether it's a case of April Dawn making, you know, thousands of Polaroid photographs as sort of keepsakes for the, you know, the future, or someone like Vince, who is, you know, so moved by how such a silly, flat thing can be so provocative and so melancholic and so sweet and so strange, how it projects out into these other dimensions. So that's just kind of a few things that I think about related to photography.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also leads, you know, in a kind of hokey, but also not so hokey way to, you know, ideas of development, of like something that you don't get in one kind of atomic blast, which of course there are things that arrive like that and it can be really exciting or crushing, but there's also this kind of slow understanding or something coming into focus. And, you know, if left around too long, maybe going dark again, like overdeveloped or something like that. But I think it's a really, that aspect of that work of Trisha's that you were talking about does that. It's like, oh, it's like, you know, the kind of dark room or camera obscura of the mind that has to, where this thing develops. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because so many of these artists are really withholding in a certain way. I mean, they do their work, but they're really not, and they make exhibitions, but they're not exhibitionists. They're not known for, you know, sitting for interviews. They're not known for their headshots. Some of these people you can't find, you know, online at all by design, of course. So it seems that there's some relationship there between like, well, I just wonder how these artists, I'm interested in how these artists think about getting their work out into the world, and let's say like developing artworks and valuing a kind of audience, and at the same time staying in the dark room, staying in the red room, staying underdeveloped, and not wanting to sort of over bake it. Or at least that's something that I continually go back to and sort of struggle with myself personally, because I really like artists and I really like telling stories, and by nature I'm just kind of a booster for the things that I believe in. And sometimes I feel like maybe I've betrayed these artists because I just want to talk about it, or I want to tell other people about it. But at the same time, of course, I want to respect, it's not just privacy, but it's like, it's a strategy, you know. I think it's a really effective strategy for some of these people. And I also think that in a certain way, if you want to talk about like development or something developing, these are artists who really, and there are many more artists like this too, they couldn't work faster, you know, if you wanted them to. It just doesn't, it's not like that. It's not like we'll chop in the studio. These are just like that particular Trisha piece. They kind of work on their own time and their own terms. And I really do respect that way of working. Of course, now more than ever, when like, I mean, whenever, we don't need to talk about Instagram, but like images are toys, you know, like there's this guy, David Giordano, who designed the book, who's a great friend of mine in Chicago. And he has this great rant about how images are toys and they're so easy to play with and they have so much importance in our culture. And I was telling him that, you know, I sort of confessed that, you know, I'm on Instagram and I run this gallery and I do a lot of posting, because not that much, because I want people to come over and check it out. And I was talking about how I was kind of like wondering if there's anything like street cred anymore, like in this like current day and age, you know what I mean? And he's like, sorry to break it to you, buddy, but when you got your Instagram account, you lost all your street cred, you know what I mean? Like that is, there's no development there. There's no time there. And that's why it's really such an unsatisfying space.
Well, I mean, I think the book is in many ways about conversations with friends or people that might become friends, or there's something about friendship and the temporality of friendship. And I think what's underestimated about long-term friendship is how much tending and attention it needs. I think people have this idea that friendship is just like, oh, you're friends with people, it's very easy. It's like, it's actually requires a very beautiful kind of attentiveness, or else it can become a different kind of relationship. And I think the book tracks that not only between people, some of the conversations you're having, but also what the dynamic of a relationship with a work of art is or can be. And I think that is very powerful in a way that isn't often acknowledged.
Huh. Wow, that's nice. Yeah, I mean, this obviously this world of art is really personal for me because of the people who are here and who I get to know as a result of having the interest that I do, or doing the work that I do. So, you know, I saw that the Redwood and the Raven, you know, when I was 24 years old, and it's there. It's just kind of in there. And I find that even as a curator with the works that I show, you know, I think about like a sort of pie in the sky exhibition that I'd like to make one day in the world or something. And it's really not like a biennial, you know what I mean? It's just like all the works that I've loved.
Oh, why not? Oh, Jordan, I'm shocked.
Which like should never happen. But I feel like I kind of like mate for life with these things. And that's, and so similarly, you know, I run this exhibition space, but it's not like there's 7 ideas like waiting to go. It's really kind of, it's like much more intense than that. It's mostly people that I know, or if I don't know them, then reach out and like really try to get to know them and form some kind of a relationship or a friendship and feel out what sort of show might make sense and what do they want to show now. And I think that's one, I think I'm lucky to have this space that I do have, not that we need to totally get into the Cushionworks thing, but to have this exhibition space in San Francisco that is, you know, upstairs from a place that actually make cushions, and the people who run the cushion business, for those of you who don't know on the call, are just really supportive. The whole second floor of that building happens to be artist studios, because the owner of the business, Susan, went to CCAC here in town years ago and studied textiles and has a soft spot in her spot for art. So it's like, it shouldn't happen, you know what I mean? And it's a really lucky thing that I think allows me to sort of trade on or build on the friendships that I've made and the relationships that I've built with artists and with artworks, and hopefully to keep doing it. I realize that's a little.
No, I mean, in some ways it makes me kind of want to straddle two of the things we've been talking about. You know, it's not a shock to anyone who's visiting with us tonight, but you know, San Francisco has changed enormously, and I don't want this to become like a question about nostalgia and the good old days, because I hate those kinds of conversations. But the fact of the matter is, it has changed enormously in the last decade or so, and I wondered if that change, or those changes, since it's not only one kind of change, factored into how the book came together, because all the living artists you discuss are currently mid-career or older, you know, people like Trisha, like Dewey, like Vince, or figures like Ruth Asawa and DeFeo and Bruce Connor, who are paradigmatic of a perhaps gentler and, let's say, the city's real estate allowed an aesthetically more rambunctious or permissive state of being there. And I just wondered if you if there was a moment where you thought like, oh my gosh, this is going to become a picture of San Francisco of a quite recent, but maybe strikingly different time, you know, than it will be. And then it was in terms of Jay DeFeo, Bruce Conner, Ruth Asawa's kind of moment.
Yeah, I wanted to do that without saying that I was doing that. And I wanted to do that maybe without even knowing that I was doing that in a funny way. I mean, I think that like one of the ways that I think it's important to note, as a way of trying to get to the question, that like there was Julia Klein, the amazing publisher at Soberscove, is an old friend of mine and was committed to publishing a book about Jay DeFeo. Okay. And about the story of Jay DeFeo's Estocada, and the morning after the rose was famously carried out the bay window in San Francisco, the next day she tears down a work from her hallway, and over the course of many years, reanimates these physical chunks of the destroyed thing. And Julia says, "That's great. Why don't you do a book? I'm in." Mm-hmm. And then it became this other thing. I kept hearing these other voices in my head. And I think that one of the reasons that it was, I don't want to say that I'm happy with it, that sounds goofy, but that it is itself, is because there was never a book proposal. You know what I mean? And I feel like it's really anomalous in that way. And I feel very grateful for that. And I feel like if we want to talk about sort of San Francisco in those days, or even like the world kind of in those days, or the art world specifically, there was just less proposalizing. I mean, there were less stakeholders, there were less deliverables, there was less marketing, there was less branding, there was less visibility, there were fewer Instagram accounts, there were less artists making their own sweatshirts or whatever. And so it's hard to say I'm nostalgic for that time, because the truth is I don't really know much about that time, but I do know kind of like what intrigues me. And as far as I'm concerned, these artists are like as good as it gets, you know? And I think that some of them, it's curious because some of them, at least I've been thinking about them in terms of like insiders or outsiders or both, or in relation to what. And some of them are like, you know, famous, like no two ways about it. And some are not. And that, like that didn't intrude on my thinking too much, because they're all like of a similar frame of mind, or they all tap into a really similar frequency with regards to work, especially in this city. But yeah, like I do worry for this town's future, without getting into, you know, how the rent, my God. But I do think it's much harder for artists now to retain a sense of like no holds barred, you know, independence. Artists were, I think, able to succeed here, I mean, on their terms, because the city didn't want or need them, you know? And so it's like, again, I feel like it's a funny way of answering the question, but what I'm reminded of is like, you know, they do national poetry, well, City Lights. So there's National Poetry Month, this sort of thing. And like and then they're like the hardcore poets who are detractors, you know, who are like, why would you want to give away like the last secret? You know what I mean? Like the last cool cultural secret that we've got. You're like, does it really need a freaking like Twitter handle? And like, I love that, you know what I mean? It's complicated for me because again, like I want to tell the story, but I get that. So anyway, I'm also like really committed to getting stories down before I feel like they're gonna, like they might vanish. And so younger artists or newer stories just don't have that same kind of pull for me. I mean, at Cushion Works, I make exhibitions with, you know, younger artists all the time. And I'm thrilled to do that because like, there's no story yet. I mean, that's kind of equally compelling to me. That's just not a book. Yes. And then I was like, let's see what you're working on. But I do fear that like this way of working in the conditions that made it possible are just harder to line up, just don't fit together in the same sort of way anymore. And I hear you. I feel like it's hard to get into those ideas or work through those ideas without falling prey to like kind of nostalgia, you know, or worse, because I think there are things that are worse than that too.
Yeah, I think it might be good to have you read just a little bit more maybe about J. DeFeo's Estocada, because it's a piece that many people are not going to know. And but just before I say that, like frame it by picking up on some of the things you said. It's like J. DeFeo is one of those artists who becomes, you know, I want to say, obviously, The Rose is an amazing, astounding, complicated work, but it did become a kind of burden. It's like, oh, right, The Rose, J. DeFeo, as if she did nothing else. And what's so beautiful is the kind of simultaneity of this other thing that you choose to write about, and bringing its story, or like how it took maybe years for it to unfold. And so it ties in a lot with this, how do we find time to do what needs to be done, or to give something the time it needs to become what it might be. So
yeah. All right, so I maybe a little bit from the origins of this Estocada piece, just a couple pages. It begins with a quote from Jay from a lecture she gave at Mills College where she taught, and it's from 1986. She says, "The last 6 months of The Rose, I started this drawing," because it's mythologized that over the course of her making this rose that took her 8 years, that she worked on nothing else. You know, that she thought of nothing else, and she was just totally married to the thing, which is largely true, but it's not exclusively true. Anyway, before her extended stay in Florence, where she went after she went to Cal, DeFeo spent several months of her graduate fellowship in Paris and London, dutifully exploring museums, and more eccentrically scouring libraries for depictions of prehistoric rock art to trace on paper. A few friends drove a rented car from France to Spain, where she savored the arid landscape, and in Barcelona experienced her first and last bullfight. This is a quote. "I was sitting in the audience and there was something that slapped me on the back of the neck. It turned out to be the tail. Finally, I found myself surrounded and covered by Spaniards. It's sort of like at the ballpark when somebody hits a fly ball. And I just didn't know what. I reached to the back of my neck, and the blood on my neck, and people pouncing all over me. Especially good battles occasion a matador's victory lap. If a critical number of spectators petition with waving handkerchiefs, the hero is awarded the ear of the dead animal. The most significant prize, granted solely at the presiding dignitary's discretion, is the gift of both ears and a tail." It left a mark. At home on Fillmore Street 13 years later, DeFeo broke 5 staple guns attaching a constellation of paper directly to her hallway wall to craft her memory's kill. I should note that earlier I explained that the term Estocada means the kill. It's a bullfighting term. DeFeo described it as a huge space, the hallway, a studio in her own right. If, like past efforts, she was driven by a play of opposites, which flip side was in question as she set the material stage for this new offering? If, as she noted of her rose, everything I've done is in there, then what wasn't? The rose was in no way a guaranteed success, and with each passing year, the psychological stakes rose to dizzying heights. Maybe Estocada was a release valve, a slow leak to free an undeniable tension. Maybe it was an executioner's song, employed to finally send off her tremendous painting. Maybe it represented the end of her marriage, a last gasp. Or maybe it was much less dramatic, the next work of art, and one that was quite different than the last. If the rose risks mythologizing, so too does its destroyed shadow. Artists commit to artworks and institutions all the time, and intuitions all the time, and for reasons that ultimately remain ordinary, personal, and unknowable. Either way, her wall of paper may have been more difficult to save than the rose due to its architectural attachment, though she hoped it would one day be safely removed and reconstructed on a coherent backing, trusting to God that, quote, some good angel might facilitate its happy afterlife.
Of which the book is a part. Two related questions, and then maybe we'll open things up to questions from the assembled audience, if that's okay. I say two related. I'm going to ask it as one. It's a question about like how long you worked on the book, and but by way of something else. You curated a show with Vincent Fecteau in New York called So I Traveled a Great Deal in 2017, and it ended up being 6 Northern California artists. And I wonder if you were already working on the book at that point, or if it was in some way explicitly or implicitly or both helpful in thinking toward Rip Tales, because even though none of those artists in that show are in the book, I don't think, or don't recall, that there is something about the sleuthing and gumshoeing and fitting together stories and bringing works out of long buried archives in, the suburbs. And I just wondered about that when I was thinking about the book.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. That show that Vince Fecteau and I organized at Matthews was, how do I say it? It was sort of unpremeditated. We went in with a very sort of associative frame of mind. So we're both fairly allergic to the idea of thematic exhibitions, clearly, or in the work that we do. So it's kind of like, what's out there? What's interesting? What hasn't made its way to New York, let alone, Matthews Gallery on 24th Street or whatever it is. So it was like the low to high thing was really exciting. And we just started talking to people, and, we're largely interested in, like, same deal, either mid-career or later or gone, so we're meeting widows and hanging out in some archives and asking questions. And we just, for whatever reason, we just have like astonishingly similar taste and instincts. And so the thing was, it was really fun. And it was really smooth. And I think that we made a show, because we kind of know the territory, we made a unique show. I'm not saying it's good or bad or great or whatever, but I'm not sure anyone else could have done it. And Rip Tales was not on my mind explicitly at all at that point. I ran into Julia at the San Francisco Book Fair here, maybe the next summer. And I was doing some DeFeo archival research for a show that I was organizing at Frankel Gallery, the great photo gallery, Jeffrey Frankel's place here in San Francisco. And was just sniffing around and asking questions, and started to uncover this story that seemed so interesting and seemed like kind of an impossible story to tell, or an excitingly kind of weird story to tell, because the object at its center was destroyed and was never photographed and no longer exists. So ahistorical, from the get-go. And so I was just talking to Julia about it, and she said, how'd you like to make a book about that? And I said, I wouldn't want to. I just would not. There's so many other things I'd rather do than that. And I just couldn't shake the idea at all. And then I spent the summer research, wondering if there was a story for me to tell. I didn't know how I was going to tell it. I've never embarked on a project like this. Oh no. Anyway,
you snapped back. You were frozen. The image was frozen, but at least for me, the audio remained. It phased out, but was discernible.
Okay, it's like the dreaded Zoom ticker. Jesus. Anyway, and so I just sort of like read everything that I could about Jay, and I already knew that I was devoted to her practice, but really, felt for her and wanted to know as much as I could possibly know, and then had these kind of I never knew how to act on the phone with Julia afterwards, saying, well, what if Trisha's involved? And then and I'm also thinking about Vince. And initially it was like, well, that sounds good, but maybe it's like, what about this Jay thing that we talked about? And then when it was clear that it was going to just take what whatever direction it was going to take. And I was invested. She was totally amazing. It was like, look, I'm in for whatever this becomes. And so I think it took about, I mean, the pandemic was on my side. It's kind of rude to say that, but I wrote this during the pandemic, really, and during the showing up to Cushionworks. And for someone who opens up their space and wants to have people in and talk about art, and there was nothing for me to do.
Yeah.
So I think it was probably 2 years from start to finish.
Okay. Great. You're willing to take some questions, right? Should we? I don't know how we do this. I think Peter reads the questions, perhaps. I'm not quite sure. I haven't opened up chat. Maybe it's going to say.
Yeah, people are still a little in shell shock. I think it takes like about approximately a minute to a minute and a quarter for people to formulate questions from the moment you ask them to. So let's just give them a second.
Okay, sure.
And then I can call stuff as soon as it begins to kind of roll out. But if you want to keep it going for a little
No, totally. Jordan, what in terms of was there, if this, I mean, in a kind of light-hearted way, if the book is The Rose that you worked on for a shorter period than The Rose, but was there immediately a kind of off-ramp? Was there an Estocada while you were working on the book going, whether it was a show, I'm not saying it's another book, but like, was there something, it's like, oh, it's becoming, I don't want this to be, this needs some, a kind of buffer or complement or out or off-ramp, but to get it to where it needs to be?
Yeah, wow, that's such an interesting question that I've never thought about. I only have one experience writing a book. I don't really know what it's like more broadly. I don't really know what it's like for other people, but there was plenty of stuff that I wrote that ended up on the cutting room floor. So it wasn't exactly like a bee, it wasn't like or in the hallway over there. But I do, your question does make me think about that stuff now, because some of it I think just didn't fit with the book. You know what I mean? Or there were artists who maybe I wanted to jive with it, but just ran, above or below or something. And that stuff, I don't know if I'm ever going to touch it again, but there were a few things that I started to write that just didn't feel right for some other reason. I'm not sure I can necessarily put my finger on it, but one had to do with with curatorial practice and kind of like associative ways of working, and the way that I feel like sometimes curators cut the picture to fit the frame, if we want to use a kind of photo-y metaphor, when they're doing their work. And I would like to do some, and it involves some historical research and one particular painting, strangely by Toulouse-Lautrec, just wouldn't have any place in it. And so I'd like to take that up, and it's kind of fun to think about something like that in terms of wow, are those my shards of this thing that will come to life, that have been planted in the compost bucket of the brain or whatever.
What are you, what shows are coming up at Cushionworks right now? What's, because you just had a show with Gay Outlaw, right?
Yeah, that was kind of a funny, great show. Gay is an amazing artist who's lived here for a whole bunch of years, and had a solo exhibition maybe 2016, 2017 with a whole bunch of works. The gallery was just so busy with things, and there was one particular sculpture made of bronze that was just, how do I say it? It was doing the giving withholding thing. It wasn't telling me something that I really needed to know. And I just kind of made a note that I'd love to see that thing isolated and with nothing else. And so I was finally able to do the show. It's just this one bronze sculpture, and it's so beautiful, and it's absolutely strange. And it's probably a show that, they wouldn't have let me get away with anywhere else. And then,
the pictures look so amazing. I mean, I have to say, I'm very upset that I didn't get to see it, but I have looked at the pictures a lot. It's really looks
great. Yeah, it's a wonderful work. She's a great artist.
So there is a question, a first question from Andrew Cameron. Hi, Andrew. I'm just going to read it. So do you think the works that DeFeo ultimately made from the fragments of the work that was destroyed were conceived as works on their own, or in more or less of a relation to what was destroyed? I guess my question is about completion and what that might mean.
Andrew Cameron, I salute you. That is a really good question. And I think about that question a lot. And I try toward the end of the book to get at that question. And if I can try to like loop back to how we started the hour without being too something. One of the reasons why photography is interesting to me, at least, is because it seems to have a relationship with storytelling and with narrative, but it's a single frame. Well, it's many, many things, but let's say sometimes it's a single frame. And so it's not necessarily anti-narrative, but it's just kind of doing its own thing. I mean, I'm not talking about photojournalism here. I'm talking about something else. And I think that, at least in my life and in thinking about Jay, I'm consistently drawn to stories and artists who tell stories and artists' lives and where artists come from and how it informs their work. But at the same time, oftentimes with art, I don't want to know the stories. I just want to be like that with that Trisha piece, just want to be sort of blasted into new territory altogether, not necessarily even ask any questions about it. Like with Gay Outlaw's piece, I didn't really want to know anything about it, which she may have thought that was peculiar, but really I just wanted to show the thing, look at the thing, and invite people to come over. With Estocada in particular, I was really interested in when, for Jay, speculating, of course, and with the help of Leah Levy and Dawn Troy, these amazing women who work at her foundation, was there a point in which this stuff that we seem to think Jay thought of as post-Estocada or Estocada related or fragments of Estocada, was there a point when it became its own thing? And how does that happen and why does that happen? And I make kind of like a funny poetical case in the book that in fact we end with one object in particular that's what you might say is a contentless photograph. It's a collage that's all black, it's exposed paper, and it's sort of stitched together in this funny way. And there's no image on it whatsoever. And it's not quite an argument, but I make a kind of a case in my own way that maybe this is not only a work, like the first and only work from that stuff that's post-Estocada, that has nothing to do with Estocada, has nothing to do with any content whatsoever, in fact. You would never know it's involved. But simultaneously, it's a photograph of the thing that was never photographed. It's this impossible picture of the thing that doesn't exist anymore. So anyway, I think it's a great question, and it's one that I think about a lot. You know, not just in relation to Jay's work.
Well, I think there's this way that the book takes up, the kind of dialectic between destruction and creation. I mean, not to be but there's so many points in the book where with Estocada, but also I think of the Bruce Conner piece that ends the work in the garden, which it's like it's in the process of, on some level being ruined, on some level becoming the thing that it might be, like seeping into the ground or seeping into the garden or what that might be. And it makes me think of the conversation you have with Vincent Fecteau about the arrest of the building, of building being built, like just the kind of stoppage of it is kind of pivoted between unfinished or completion. It's the book picks up on this in many ways. And I think the click or the flash of the photo does something about capturing that, the kind of strobe effect of, are we creating something or something disappearing or being destroyed or something like that?
That really, that really resonates. And that Bruce Conner piece in particular, well, he made it, he worked with various pseudonyms later in his life. And this particular painting that is, let's say, on long-term loan to a backyard in Noe Valley. And there's an interview with its owners kind of thing that ends the book. the painting is made by Anonymous, which was one of Bruce's aliases, and it was an homage to the painting is called Homage to DeFeo. And over the course of several years, it's destroyed, and that is, by intentionally and by design, the thing disintegrates. And so, yeah, I wonder about that. It's an homage to DeFeo that turns to nothing. I mean, it's such a beautiful, simple idea, and it's brought to you by Anonymous. I mean, the stuff is happening all the time. And Bruce said about Anonymous, this is a great quote of Bruce's. Lindsay will probably remember it. It's something like, look at the work of Anonymous through the centuries. You know what I mean? They're making the best work.
We have another question from Rosa, who asks, would you say the structure of the book could work as a prototype for another one? How is the structure of how you wrote the book dependent on how the artists work / have worked?
Yeah, good question, Rosa. Yeah, I mean, I think there's no reason why it couldn't necessarily work as a prototype, but it kind of shouldn't, I guess. It just kind of, not to sound goofy, but it just kind of emerged. You know, I in conversations with my friend Claudia Larocco, great writer, poet, editor, who really edited the manuscript part of it before it got all these images and turned into this kind of wild thing. She was really encouraging me to break it up and to chop it up and to interrupt this story of Jay's a whole bunch of times. And because the story of Estocada is one involved in fragmentation and disappearance and destruction and creation, it sort of made sense to me that, you know, to stop and go and to weave, especially if we're exploring ideas of anonymity and creation and where one work starts and another work ends and vice versa. So I would be really suspicious of myself if I employed this particular strategy again. And I hope not to, unless the work is telling me to, and maybe, I mean, it's very possible that I could be attracted to a really similar kind of story again. I mean, why wouldn't
I? We have a question from Sarah Lehrer-Grawer. Hey, Sarah. What kind of writing / words did DeFeo leave behind in the archive / historical record that guided you? Or how do you deal with her intentions in your thinking through Estocada?
Yeah, gosh, another good question. The DeFeo Foundation are fine shepherds, and they have so much stuff that, I mean, it's a great archive. It really feels like a living archive because, how do I say this? Jay was so prodigious, and it's hard to distinguish oftentimes what is let's say, like a scrap or a fragment or a piece of a collage from an artwork. Was this finished? Well, she didn't show it. Well, hello, she didn't show much in her lifetime, so how do we know? So the way that I understood it from the foundation is if there's kind of like any chance that this particular piece of material was used in the creation of an artwork, even if it was abandoned, it was a sort of byproduct, it's sort of tagged in the archive as an artwork. It has like an artwork sort of serial number sort of thing. I thought it was a really neat way to think about keeping things organized, even if it is in the dark. I mean, that maybe someone like me could come around and animate it in a kind of way, which is what I love to do, or at least try to do. And then there also are, there are great lectures, there are great interviews. People wanted to know what she was thinking. And, you know, the foundation was great because I remember at some point it was like, well, you know, Leah, how should we talk about this? Is this a rip or is this a tear? You know, just like, well, let me see how Jay thought about it. And then, you know, like the next day it would be like, here are the 14 mentions when she said rip in a lecture. It's like, I mean, God, with gold, total gold for someone like me. So it was an amazing window to be able to, I just couldn't have done this project without hearing her voice like that. And to, you know, I think intentions is kind of a complicated word for a variety of reasons, but it did allow me to get sort of like go straight into how she was thinking and talking at the time, and not just making.
Yeah. Peter, I don't know if we're at time or
Yeah, we're actually out of time,
we're out of
but
time. Okay.
but this is really so compelling. I could just sit and listen to the two of you go on, and maybe this is also opening up the way for another forum at some point or other in the not too distant. Rip Tales really opens up so many doors to San Francisco art history and the creative process, and of course, such a great tribute to DeFeo. So, and then many threads connecting City Lights to the book. So thank you, Jordan, for what you've done. Thank you, Bruce, for being such an excellent interlocutor and just picking up on so many great things, ideas. And a big shout out to Julia at Soberscove for everything that they do. I have actually posted links in the chat function, so please check them out as well and buy the book if you have not. So and thanks to all of you in the audience for being here. You always complete the circle. And tonight's event was made possible by the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, into the future.
It's amazing to be here. Thank you, Peter. So if folks are interested in the book, I urge you to get it through City Lights. It's such a pivotal, important institution in the town where I live. Thank you, Bruce, for being such a brilliant and kind and generous interlocutor. I so appreciate it. And thanks everybody for being here.
Bye, Peter. Bye, Jordan. Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Thanks for
Bruce.
coming.